Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Ange Kirchhoff, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, we're going to be talking about Sony Michel, running back for the New England Patriots, and whether or not he's going to be an RB1 come the 2019 fantasy football season. So on today's agenda, I'm going to be talking about the New England Patriots and how they've pretty much shifted the tides of their offensive game plan and their scheme to being a run-first offense. Then after that, I'm going to give you details, statistics on Sony Michel and how I think he will fare come the 2019 season. Then I'll talk a little bit about James White and how he contributes to this offense. It may hurt or could potentially help Sony Michel come 2019. So that's the agenda on today. And at the end, I'll kind of give you my closing thoughts on Sony Michel. But without further ado, let's get into that, shall we? Hey everybody, how's it going? So why did I want to make a video on Sony Michel specifically? Well, I thought, just looking at the landscape as of right now, not a lot of people are talking about Sony Michel. People are talking about the Patriots here and there. Obviously, they just captured another Super Bowl victory. Rob Gronkowski just retired. Robert Kraft is getting tugged on in Florida. There's stuff like that that's going around, right? Demaryius Thomas was just recently signed, but nobody's really paying attention to Sony Michel. And I thought I'd kind of bring to everyone's attention that Sony Michel could really potentially be an RB1 come the 2019 season. So before we begin, I kind of want to give you guys a little bit of rundown and kind of a background check on how the New England Patriots offense has kind of been working the last couple of years and how they've really turned into a run-first offense. So in the last three seasons, 2016, 17, and 18, the New England Patriots have produced three different running backs in fantasy football within the top 15 in half-point PPR scoring. So what exactly does that mean? Well, in 2016, they had LeGarrette Blount as the number 8 running back at the end of the season in half-point PPR. In 2017, Dion Lewis was the number 15 running back. And just this past season in 2018, James White ended as the number 9 running back. So in 3 consecutive years, we've had New England Patriots running backs really competing for that top echelon RB1 stature. And, statistically, what did LeGarrette Blount do in 2016? Well, he had some pretty ridiculous stats. Touched the ball 306 times, had 1,199 total yards, 18 rushing touchdowns. Pretty ridiculous, right? But that's not to say that kind of numbers are not capable for a guy like Sony Michel, because in 2017, Dion Lewis had pretty similar numbers. Obviously, the touchdown count didn't go up there, and his touches weren't even close, yet he still produced, ended up as the number 15 running back with only 212 touches, almost 80 touches less, 1,110 yards, and 9 rushing touchdowns. Just this past season, like I mentioned before, James White had 181 touches for 1,176 yards and 12 touchdowns. So, the New England Patriots, they believe in an RB1. Yes, this last season with James White, a lot of his statistics came from the passing game, but that was mainly due to the fact that Sony Michel, in his rookie season, only played 12 games healthy, kind of struggled throughout the year. Rex Burkhead missed almost the entirety of the season. So this offense kind of had to lean towards James White in the passing game, and yet he still produced as the number 9 running back in half-point PPR scoring. So some other stats that I pulled with the New England Patriots. They've really become a run-first offense. Just in the last 3 seasons, in 2016, they ran the ball with running backs. Okay, I'm not going to count, the quarterback scrambling or wide receiver runs. I'm just counting running backs. In 2016, they ran the ball 410 times, 410 running back rushing attempts. 2017, 404, and 2018, 431. So just in the past 3 years, on average, 415 running back rushing attempts from the New England Patriots, which is a ridiculously high number. Just this past season, the New England Patriots ran the ball 45% of the time. We know Tom Brady, he's getting older, and they're trying to get the ball out of his hands as much as possible in order to keep him healthy. Even though they've got one of the best offensive lines in the NFL, keeping the ball out of his hands, giving the ball to the plethora of running backs they have behind him, is only going to help him set up play action. And that's what the New England Patriots have really been keying in on the last couple of years. In 2018, the New England Patriots had the 3rd most rushing attempts amongst all NFL teams, the 5th most rushing yards, and the 4th most rushing touchdowns throughout the entire 2018 regular season. So they were obviously in the top 5 of the 3 major rushing stats, which is pretty ridiculous because when you think of the New England Patriots, you think of, Edelman, Gronk, Tom Brady passing the ball. But in the last couple of years, they've really shifted away from that, and they've kind of dictated their offense with the running game. And the best way to do that is behind a great offensive line. Last season, according to Pro Football Focus's end-of-season rankings, the New England Patriots offensive line was the 4th-ranked offensive line amongst all 32 teams. Yes, they're going to be missing their left tackle this year, but that's 2 seasons in a row. I think the left tackle that they just had this past season is going to the Raiders. The year prior, Nate Solder signed with the Giants. No big deal. They're just going to let them go, and they're going to continue to have a great offensive line because you've got great coaches. You bring in great talent to supplement. No big deal, right? On top of that, they've got one of the best fullbacks in the NFL, James Devlin, who played 35% of offensive snaps last year. They really like to run that ISO. And if you've got James Devlin, Sony Michel in that backfield, you're running downhill behind such a great offensive line. You're going to get yards without a doubt. So, other than that, let's go ahead and move on. Let's talk about Sony Michel in specifics, right? So like I mentioned before, he played 12 games last year. Technically, if you go and look at his game logs, he technically played 13 games. But against the Bears in, I think, week 10, if I'm not mistaken, week 10, 11, 9 maybe, I don't know. He basically played the first drive, had a couple carries here and there, and then he got hit in the knee, and boom, he was done for the rest of the game. So in my opinion, just looking at it from the outside in, I'm really just going to say he played 12 games in order to kind of keep everything in balance, right? So without that game counting, Sony Michel last season had 205 rushing attempts for 909 rushing yards, 6 rushing touchdowns, only 10 targets, 6 receptions for 36 yards, and 0 receiving touchdowns. We're not expecting Sony Michel to have much of a presence in the receiving game. I'm sure he's capable, but with a guy like James White on roster, they don't really need to pressure him to work in the passing game. Now, a couple of statistics that I kind of extrapolated to kind of give you guys an idea of how much Sony Michel played last season. His snap share last season, he played 316 offensive snaps of the 834 snaps that he was eligible for. So not counting those 4 games because he was completely out of them, he only played 37.89% of offensive snaps. Now, having only played that many offensive snaps, you'd be thinking, okay, Sony Michel's not going to get that many carries. But with 316 offensive snaps and carrying the ball 205 times, I mean, every time he's in the game, he was touching the ball. With the New England Patriots on top of that, running the ball nearly 30 times a game, I think it was 29.87 times per game. Sony Michel is in there, and he's going to touch the ball every time he's in the game. Now, obviously, throughout the beginning of the season, Sony Michel missed the first game of the year because of a little bit of a preseason mishap with his knee. No big deal. They eventually got him acclimated. His snap share wasn't too high, but he got into a groove and eventually got to the point where he was carrying the ball 17 times a game during the regular season, which is exactly what we expect to see with a running back like Sony Michel. The New England Patriots, they went out and they drafted Sony Michel in the first round. The last time they drafted a running back in the first round was 2014 with James White. So they knew that Sony Michel, after letting Dion Lewis go, Sony Michel was going to be the future of this backfield. They went out, they took that first round pick, that highly coveted first round pick, and they spent it on him because they know for a fact going through the future, it's going to be Sony Michel leading this offense. Now, looking at a couple other stats, red zone rushing attempts. He had 42 last season for 5 rushing touchdowns. Like I've mentioned in prior videos, especially my Todd Gurley video. If you haven't checked that out, go check that out. Red zone rushing attempts really make a difference when it comes to fantasy point output. The 5 leading running backs last season in red zone rushing attempts were the 5 highest scoring running backs in fantasy. Gurley, Ezekiel Elliott, Christian McCaffrey, Saquon, and Alvin Kamara. All 5 of those guys led in red zone rushing attempts. And guess what? They all led in fantasy points at their position. On top of that, last season, he had 10 goal line carries, 50 evaded tackles, 133.6 fantasy points, which made it for about 11.13 fantasy points per game. So Sony Michel, statistically, he was great. No big deal. But what we eventually saw throughout the regular season was, when you have Sony Michel working back from an injury, they're not going to just give him all the carries. This is a guy for the future. This is the running back that they want to establish going for the next 10 plus years, right? So what are they going to do? They're going to protect this guy. Sony Michel didn't really see too many offensive snaps, as I mentioned earlier. But as soon as we got to the playoffs, as soon as the New England Patriots got into that, hey, it's one or done, win or go home, they completely shifted the offensive game plan towards Sony Michel. And I expect it to really look like this in 2019. So against the Chargers in week, I think 18 of the, week 18 total, but the first week, I guess it was the second week of the playoffs. Against the Chargers, he had 24 rushing attempts, 129 rushing yards, 3 rushing touchdowns, 32.3 fantasy points. The next week against the Chiefs, 29 rushing attempts for 113 rushing yards, 2 rushing touchdowns, 23.3 fantasy points. And against the Rams in the NFL Super Bowl, 18 rushing attempts, 94 yards, a touchdown, 15.4 fantasy points. The dude was a monster. If you accumulate all of his rushing attempts throughout the entire season and playoffs, he nearly had 18.4 rushing attempts per game, which is truly what at least I am expecting to see. With, LeGarrette Blount in the past having 299 rushing attempts. We've seen just this last year, Sony Michel was given 209 rushing attempts throughout the entire season, right? And that was him only playing 12 games, right? And as a rookie with only 38% of the offensive snap share. Like, that's ridiculous that the fact every time he comes in the game, he is going to touch the ball. So why have I brought up Sony Michel? Specifically right now, his ADP is sitting around 34, the 34th player off the board, and he's sitting around RB15. Now, here's the thing. We know for a fact that New England Patriots love to run the ball. They've shown that in the last couple of seasons. We know for a fact that they're going to hand their RB1 the ball probably upwards of 275 times. That's going to be Sony Michel's position. On top of that, when they get into the red zone, I mean, goodness gracious, they love running the ball. And not only that, we saw James White with 7 rushing touchdowns just this last season. I'll get into James White in a little bit more. But a lot of those touchdowns came in games where Sony Michel was out. So if you give Sony Michel all the production, more snaps, more carries, I mean, the fantasy production is there. The RB1 potential is absolutely there. Now, the other running backs that kind of sit around Sony Michel right now, as he sits at RB15, the names are like Leonard Fournette, Marlon Mack, Derrick Henry, Nick Chubb, Chris Carson. Now, a lot of those guys sit around him, whether they're above him or below him. The thing is, a lot of these running backs that are sitting here at the RB2 rank, none of them, or even low-end RB1, none of them work in the passing game. I've seen it around the fantasy landscape that the ADP of Leonard Fournette is a little bit higher than Sony Michel. And I'm thinking to myself, well, how is that even possible? Leonard Fournette is not going to catch the ball. Neither is Sony Michel. No big deal. But who's going to touch the ball more? I'm honestly here to predict that Sony Michel is going to get maybe, just as many carries as Leonard Fournette or a Marlon Mack or Derrick Henry. But he's going to be able to produce because the offense is dictating a run-first scheme. They've predicated their entire offensive scheme to, hey, get James Devlin in there. We've got a great offensive line. Plunge it down the middle 100% of the time. Comparatively, I'm telling you, yes, sure, Leonard Fournette in a Jaguars offense could be good, but guess what? Their offensive line's not great. You have Nick Foles at quarterback. Great, okay. But when we're talking about a New England Patriots offense that's scoring 25 points per game, I mean, who doesn't want a piece of that offensive action? Okay, sure, Marlon Mack, he could be great. He's a good running back. But again, there's a guy like Nyheim Hines sitting behind him. Nick Chubb, great. He has Duke Johnson sitting right behind him. Okay, Chris Carson, what about him? Great. He's not going to touch the ball in the passing game. Majority of last season, Mike Davis took that role. And eventually, Rashad Penny's going to be the RB1 of this team. Anyway, just to kind of give you the idea that, yes, Sony Michel, he might be sitting at that RB15 spot, but I truly believe that In 2019, he's going to creep a little bit higher and higher. And hey, I'm not one to come out and say, scream it from the rooftops, we should be taking Sony Michel as a top, 12 running back. I'm here to just point out the facts and kind of give you an idea, because I don't want Sony Michel's ADP to rise to an RB12. Because if it does, then I've got to take him earlier. But if it sits around where he's sitting at, perfect. Helps me out a little bit more. But anyway, let's talk about James White a little bit before we end this video. Now, I may be saying don't be fooled, right? And that's mainly because, James White, again, he ended as the number 9 running back last season. 16 games played. He had 123 targets for 87 receptions, 751 receiving yards, and 7 receiving touchdowns. He also followed that with 94 rushing attempts for 425 rushing yards and 5 rushing touchdowns. Now, here's the stats, okay? He had 233.1 fantasy points last season, and that's mainly because he was the RB1, he was the healthy running back, and he saw so much work in the passing game for this team. Now, comparatively to seasons prior, James White has never been a 123 target kind of guy. Within this offense, when you don't have healthy running backs, when Sony Michel's out, Rex Burkhead's out, and really the offense is looking like, and also Julian Edelman was out, you have to look for, hey, we've got to get first downs. Where do we go? They went to James White for majority of the time. Now, here's the thing. Here's a stat that I found that was kind of specifically surprising, but at the same time, understandable. From weeks 7 through 9, right? It was the exact week, the same week that Sony Michel had that knee injury, and the 2 weeks prior. All 3 of those weeks, Sony Michel was out. In those 3 weeks, James White produced 71.4 fantasy points, which averaged about 23.8 fantasy points per game in those 3 weeks. Now, with 71.4 fantasy points coming in 3 weeks, that nearly accounted for 30% of James White's entire yearly fantasy total. 30% in those 3 weeks. I mean, remember, we have a 16-week season. And in 3 of those weeks, he accounted for 30% of his entire fantasy production. I mean, why is that? Well, he had 3 rushing touchdowns, which, hey, probably would have went Sony Michel's way. Cordero Patterson also got involved, had himself a rushing touchdown. And to be honest, all that opportunity that was set for James White, it was there. And it led to him rushing the ball way more than he usually does. But on top of that, it led to him having a 77% snap share within those 3 weeks. Now, in any other week where Sony Michel was healthy, James White nearly averaged about 48% of the offensive snaps. So going from 48%, 50% of the offensive snaps when Sony Michel's healthy to boom, you're sitting at 77% of the offensive, shares. I mean, obviously that is going to produce, and that is going to give you an opportunity to, settle yourself in this offense, have the goal line carries, have the extra rushing touchdowns, which usually, he's not going to account for. Outside of these 3 weeks where he had, let me go ahead and confirm that. Where he had 3 rushing touchdowns. He only had 2 other rushing touchdowns outside of those 3 weeks, which is pretty ridiculous. So when I say don't be fooled, it's around the idea that James White can potentially kind of take fantasy value away from Sony Michel. We know James White's going to be the receiving option, but that 94 carries for 425 yards and 5 rushing touchdowns, I fully expect a lot of that to go Sony Michel's way, because a lot of that came from Sony Michel being out for multiple weeks. He missed four games this season, and in those 4 games, James White was able to produce a hell of a lot of fantasy points and kind of carve himself out some opportunity there. But anyway, to kind of give you my closing statements on the idea that Sony Michel can potentially be an RB1 come the 2019 fantasy football season. I mean, when you have one of the most effective offenses at running the ball and you continuously end up in the top 5 of all rushing statistics, goodness gracious, if Sony Michel is given the opportunity to run the ball 270 times, the amount of touches he gets, sure, that's going to be a given. His yards will be there. And the really important thing is the touchdowns are going to be there. I mean, just in the last 3 seasons, the New England Patriots have been in the top 10 of rushing touchdowns each of the last 3 years. And to be honest, if Sony Michel this year is completely healthy with Brady getting older, they're going to want to continue to run that ball. And I expect them to do so with Sony Michel. So anyway, thank you everybody for watching. And until next time, keep your head on a swivel, and maybe we'll see if Sony Michel ends up being that RB1. All right, thanks. See you guys later.